Is your mic on, sir? Danielle, is your mic on?
What is it can you guys hear me?
Yes?
There you go.
All right, there we go. So what is it that I'm going to be doing today? We're going to be talking about migration. And specifically, we're going to be talking about migration from Latin America coming to the United States. And I also want to introduce a couple of different things dealing with our novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. So as I'm lecturing on migration from the South, coming to the United States, from Latin America to the United States, I will also be referencing and informing quite a bit about the novel that all of you guys are reading. All right, so let me start off by just sharing with you what my outline looks like. Please note the following. All of these slides will be on our Moodle page. I need to sort of do quite a bit of work. So if I'm speeding through the slides, don't worry. All of this will actually be placed on the meta site for FYE. All right, so this is some of the things that I want to cover today. I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to study immigration. I want to talk a little bit about the American dream and immigration. I really want to hone in on this issue of who are the immigrants. I want to make the point today that immigrants, contemporary immigrants coming to the United States are extremely, extremely diverse. And then my point 4 and 5 have to do with why is it that Latin American migrants come to the United States? And then lastly, how is it that the United States attempts to control immigration from Latin America? So that's more or less at the core of what I actually want to deliver to all of you. All right, I want to start off with this key question. Why is it that all of you should be interested in immigration? The sort of famous so what question. No? And I want to sort of deliver to all of you a couple of really, really key points. The first point is this. Immigration is a world phenomenon. It's occurring everywhere. And it usually works this way, from the south to the north, from developing nations to developed nations. What's key about developed nations is the following, that many of these powerhouse nations are being impacted by migration. Countries like the United States, Germany, England, Canada, Australia, all of these countries are being affected by legal immigration and also the so-called illegal immigration. So I mentioned this to all of you, and I think this is a very, very important point for this reason. Us as Americans, specifically for those of us who don't read the press or we don't travel enough, we only think that this issue of immigration is only affecting the United States, and that's not the case. This is a world phenomenon, and again, developed nations are being impacted by this. The third point that I want to mention is we should all be very, very interested in immigration because it's a front page issue and we need to be informed in terms of accuracy. All right? So what I want to do right now is show you all a couple of just photographs throughout the United States, throughout the world that capture this migration from the south going to the north. And I have a number of these sort of pics, and please note this, some of these are graphic, so you have been warned. All right, so here we go. This is the first photograph that I have for all of you. This is a woman rescued in the Mediterranean Sea, which is close, she was basically picked up close to North Libya. Here's another pic. These are refugees, and they basically have arrived to the island of Lesbos after crossing Turkey. Here's another pic. These are children crying. They've been introduced into Greece, and they actually want to cross to Macedonia. Here is the very graphic picture, so please. This photograph captured world attention. I remember vividly waking up and seeing the New York Times, and this is what I saw in the first page of the New York Times. This is Alan Kurdi on the shores of the Bodrum, Turkey shores. And this person, this little boy, 2 years old, passed away. His mother and his sister also were drowned. Here's another photograph. These are the police officers in the southern part of France, Calais, trying to prevent migrants heading to the Channel Tunnel going to England. Here's another photograph. This is a migrant walking through this migrant camp, again in the southern part of France, and this camp was basically burnt because the conditions were very, very unsanitary. Here's another image. If you can't make sense of what these are life vests. And they were basically picked on the shores of Lesbos because of the number of migrants trying to venture into Europe. I'm changing continents. Here are migrants from Latin America at a shelter in Tijuana, Mexico. They're sleeping, they'll probably be fed that day with these tremendous nonprofit organizations, and the next day they'll venture up and come north for el sueño americano, for the American dream. Here's another photograph. These are Latin American migrants, again, venturing into the United States. But there's other reasons why we should pay a lot of attention to migration. 16% of all the population in the United States are immigrants. This is a phenomenal number. And demographers are arguing that this number is actually going to increase in the next couple of decades. So this is key. The other reason why we should pay quite a bit of attention to migration is that it really invites us to have this dialogue and connection with people who are very, very diverse. Migration from all parts of the world into the United States is transforming the face of the United States. It's not what it used to be in the 50s and 60s. The United States is a different place because of these migratory patterns. The other reason why we should focus on this is that it really encourages us to think about migrants in a positive light. So what do they bring to the table? These folks are the best from their respective countries, and they regenerate and energize the United States. And I think we need to really be informed of who these folks are, as we're actually being drilled with very, very negative myths and stereotypes about this population. Of course, I also think that learning about migration is key because of the novel that you're all reading. Now, and I want to mention a couple of things dealing with American dream and also immigration. So this is an immigrant novel. Please remember that Junot Díaz is an immigrant himself. He actually was brought from the Dominican Republic to the United States before he was 10. And it's about becoming American. And not only becoming American, but also achieving the American dream. And as you're reading the novel, constantly be asking yourself that question. Is this specific family achieving that famous American dream? They're for sure striving for the dream, but I want you to really think about, are they achieving that dream? Let me show you very, very briefly a very, very short little piece with your writer of your novel, Junot Díaz. To become an American, and also this notion of the American dream. Let me say much more about the novel and why I think it's an immigration novel. So you all, I don't know at what point you guys are at in terms of the novel. I know for sure that you're at the sort of beginning. If you have not read the chapter dealing with the mother of Oscar and Lola, this is Belly. She has this really fun name. It's Hipatia Belicia Cabral de Leon, known by everybody in the novel as Belly. And she's the immigrant, and she's the powerhouse of that household, and she's the mother of Oscar and also Lola. And she's characterized throughout the novel as being very, very tough and harsh as a parent. And for those of you who are sons of immigrants, raise your hand if you're a son of an immigrant. You know exactly what I'm talking about. No? So Belly is exactly that way. My parents were exactly that way. So it's like they're the boss. No? They are in complete control of what's actually occurring within the household. So again, as you're reading that segment of the novel, think about the importance of who is the immigrant and who are the children of the immigrant. But for sure, Oscar and Lola are living in an immigrant enclave and in an immigrant family. Let's talk a little bit about this sort of moving back and forth between New Jersey and Santo Domingo. This is literally a case study, a sort of an exemplar of what actually occurs with Dominican migration. People never do this kind of thing. They pick up their stuff, they go to New Jersey, and forget about going to the Dominican Republic. It doesn't work like that with this particular migration patterns. It's a back and forth. It's a cyclical migration, and clearly demonstrated in the novel. No, it's really, really interesting how that is actually demonstrated in the novel. Okay, something else that's key about this is knowing about New Jersey throughout the novel. And this is what the enclave is. This is exactly the point of reception. This is what the immigrants encounter. And as you read the novel, really question yourself, what does that neighborhood look like? Who lives in those neighborhoods? Do Oscar and Lola interact with other whites? Do they interact with racial minorities? Really question yourself those kind of things. Is this a working class neighborhood? Is this a middle class neighborhood? Think about that. What we do know is that it's an enclave where there's a lot of other Dominicans, and not only other Dominicans, but also other Caribbeans, Haitians, Puerto Ricanos, and also Cubans. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about language. And I know a lot of you already have complained to your faculty members that there's a lot of Spanish, no? Well, you're going to have to deal with it, no? Because that's exactly how immigrants talk. It's about this sort of combining both languages and sometimes actually merging both languages. It's this whole idea of Span-English, no? And Dominicanos do this, and Mexicans do this, and most Latin Americans who are immigrants, we use the language in that way. Okay, so let me move on and talk a little bit about who these migrants are. And the important part of this part of my lecture is to really talk about diversifying the immigrant experience. In the sort of stereotypical way of thinking about immigrants is that immigrants are low skilled and they work in the sort of service or manufacturing industries. But what I want to present with this is that immigrants today are very diverse. Yes, we have labor migrants, and these are the ones that are very close to the sort of stereotypical view of who the immigrants are. But we also have, for example, professional immigrants. These are people who have PhDs and master's degrees and do remarkable work here in the United States. They get special visas, they're called H-1B visas, by the US government to be able to come legally to the United States to perform their work. Those are the professional migrants. We also have entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneurs are these individuals that basically establish businesses. And throughout history, Jews, 150 years ago, they were the most entrepreneurially motivated group. And today, it's Koreans and Cubans and also Dominicans. Dominicans are able to establish a plethora of different businesses throughout New Jersey, throughout New York, and all of the East Coast. And then lastly, we have the refugees. These are individuals that are fleeing for their life, and countries like the United States grants these individuals special permissions to actually stay in the United States. Please note the following. Throughout the world, anybody who's fleeing for their life is considered a refugee. But in the United States, historically, we have given the refugee clause or condition to individuals who are actually fleeing from a communist country. So Dominicans or Dominicanos, they're actually not given this category. They're not refugees. They're considered by the US government as an economic migrant, but not a refugee. All right, so let me move on and talk a little bit about this graph, which I think is very, very telling, and I want to sort of walk you through the whole graph. So this is the region of birth of all foreign-born up to 2013. And what's key is this. Notice who came in the 1960s. Basically, Europeans and Canadians. A number of decades forward, look the difference. Look where Canada is, 14%, but notice the new birth of migrants. Literally, people coming from Latin America and also Asia. And that's what I mean that the United States is transformed racially and ethnically. We have now Black Latinos, Asian, Mestizo Latin Americans, and also whites coming into the United States. And that's why the United States is just a very, very different country. Let me talk a little bit about specifically Dominican migration. The large-scale migration from the DR, this is the Dominican Republic, initiated in the 1960s. Let me ask one of you, why do you think that happened? Why in the 1960s? Anybody want to take a guess? Think about El Jefe. Do you all know who El Jefe is in the novel? Who's El Jefe or El Chivo? You guys are not reading the footnotes. Everybody has to read the footnotes. So El Jefe is the dictator, and he was basically assassinated in 1961. The dictator who has ruled that country for how many years? 30 years. Is basically killed, and everything changes in the Dominican Republic. And what ends up happening is this. We see a pattern of people coming, not only coming to the United States, but also to Europe, countries like Italy and also Spain. There's an estimated 1 million individuals of the DR who are in fact immigrants and also native-born living in the United States, 1.5. And Dominicans are one of the fastest growing immigrant groups in the United States. You can see it with this graph. Notice in 1980s, the numbers, but notice the remarkable growth. No, all the way to 2012. I haven't seen the recent statistics, but I can assure you that the growth continues. All right, let me move on and talk a little bit about why is it that immigrants migrate to the United States. So let's do a couple of shout outs. So why do you all think people migrate from Latin America to the United States? Raise your hand or just shout it out.
Higher wages.
Good job. You're stealing from my lecture. So yes, higher wages. What else?
Safer environment.
Yes, safer environment. If you live in Cali, Colombia, or Mexico City, Mexico, where I used to live, that might be an option. So good. What else? Anybody? Family reunification or family. There's a loved one that lives in the United States and you actually want to come here. So all of these are very, very good. But before I dive in to all the specifics, let me invite you to really consider this point. All major countries sending migration flows to the United States were at one point invaded, occupied, or were a home to proxy wars sponsored by the United States. This is really important. Think about what is the relationship between the United States and the Dominican Republic. The United States invaded the Dominican Republic not only once, but twice. No? And a lot of our history books indicate that the US government was very, very supportive of the Trujillo dictatorship. All right, so let me move on and literally just give you all these bullet points of why is it that immigrants come and migrate from Latin America into the United States. So wages, one of your peers mentioned, this is a key issue. So wages are higher here in the United States than in Latin America, and this is a big attraction. So people want to come here because there's a higher wage. Economists really favor this point. It's called a wage employment differential. Let me sort of provide you a concrete example with Mexico. This is the case that I know best. So the average wages earned in Mexico, as you can see here on the graph, if you're an unskilled worker, you earn an hour $1.13. If you do more or less the same type of task, you're going to be earning $11.30. So there's a $10 to 1 differential. So that's a big attraction, you know? When I always tell my students, and we're going through this, I tell them, if you tell me where I could actually earn $10, 10 times more, sign me in, because I'm there. So this is really, really important. And the same thing you could see with skilled factory workers, $2.79. In the United States would be $16.90, and that would be like a $6 1 differential. For a janitor position, 87 cents per dollar, and for the hourly, 9.37, and that's like around roughly an 11.1 differential. All right, the second point of why migrants come has to do with direct labor recruitment. So the United States actively goes and looks for people, not only in Mexico, but throughout the United States, and lures them to come and work in the United States. The best example is this program between the United States and Mexico, known as the Bracero program. The United States is in war in the 1940s. It needs agricultural workers. It looks down in its neighbor, the Mexican government. They come to an agreement, and Mexicans come legally to work in agricultural fields, predominantly in the Southwest. The program initiates in 1942, but ends all the way to 1965. By the end of the program, 4 million individuals from Mexico had come to the United States. Imagine, 4 million. Massive movement of individuals. And that is what I refer to as direct labor recruitment. Here's another example. This person's going all the way to Washington State to actually labor and probably pick apples or something like that. Let's talk a little bit about migrant networks. Migrant networks are key. I always like to tell my students, or when I lecture, if you don't have a connection or a social relationship, it's very, very difficult for you to actually move and migrate. And most of these migrants have that connection. There's somebody here in the United States that is willing to sponsor them, to help them. Let me sort of illustrate this with a number of photographs. So this is a couple, probably in New Jersey, they're Dominicanos, and these folks probably would sponsor these families who live in Santo Domingo. And that's how this actually works. And as migration patterns continue, specifically from the Dominican Republic, there's this whole making a home away from home. And this is what I'm about to actually illustrate. So here are folks playing dominoes. Domino culture is very, very important in the Caribbean. And of course, music, merengue. It's all about merengue for Dominicans. Very, very important, specific way of dancing that Latin Americans have, and Dominicans are the masters of it. Here's at one of these independence celebrations of the whole Caribbean and also the Dominican Republic. And here are some of these bodegas, or stores, that a lot of Dominicans actually establish in all of the New York City area. The other reason why migrants migrate is because of organized people smuggling. Because it's so difficult to cross from the southern border into the United States, there's a lot of money to be made by smugglers. Asian immigrants have their smugglers, and Latin American migrants have their smugglers. Among Asian immigrants, they're called snakeheads. And among Latin Americans, they're called coyotes. Let me show you this photograph. I don't know if you all could read it all the way back there. But what I love about this graph, it actually appeared in the New York Times, it basically tells you how much you would have to pay a smuggler to be actually brought brought into the United States. And what I love about this graph is this. It's not only about Mexico, people from Mexico being smuggled into the United States, but literally from all parts of the world, no? As clearly demonstrated. Notice how much it would cost if you would leave the Dominican Republic as undocumented and being brought into the United States. $12,000. $12,000. And I hope people are able to see, if you come from the Fujian area of China, $60,000. So of course, somebody needs to sponsor you in the United States. You have to have a loved one that is willing to actually give that amount of money so you could actually come as an undocumented migrant. How is it that these folks are introduced to the United States? Well, let me show you. Through land, these are Mexican migrants being transported by a coyote through the Arizona border. Here are Asian migrants being transported by people smugglers into the United States, probably into the Florida area. And here, these poor migrants have actually been detected now by this very sophisticated, sophisticated machinery that the Border Patrol has, and they were able to sort of take an X-ray of this truck, and they were able to detect that the truck was actually smuggling individuals. All right, let's talk a little bit about the localized cultures of immigration. And what does this exactly mean? So anthropologists really write about this. It's this notion that migration occurs with such degrees and with such frequency that everybody at one point or another is impacted by migration. And it almost is like a rite of passage. If you're going to become a young man, you cannot become a man if you have not migrated to the United States. And this is what sociologists and anthropologists refer to as a localized culture of immigration. Let me illustrate this with a couple of photographs. So remember I talked about this Bracero program of the 1940s? Well, this man was one of those folks, came to the United States, worked, then returned back home. But notice what happened. It was not just one generation that was impacted, but later on, the fourth generations were impacted. So the second also came, the third also came, and also this generation. Lastly, I really want to emphasize this point of the demand for immigrant labor. And you should write some kind of asterisk there in your notes. If I would actually like to zoom in on one factor of why is it that migrants come, I would really highlight this. Sometimes when people ask me, so what would you do to solve the migration patterns into the United States, specifically undocumented migration, what I always tell my audience is the following: stop giving these people work and they'll stop coming. No? So let's sort of look of what this demand for immigrant labor looks like. So here are Dominicanos working in the garment industry. Dominicans work quite a bit in low-skilled employment throughout the New York and New Jersey area, and they work in the garment industry and also in the service industry. As I mentioned earlier, Dominicans also establish small businesses, and here is one of these examples. So I've been in the East Coast. Let me move to another part of the United States. This is Tennessee. And this is what's remarkable about migration, specifically Latin American migration. We have this notion that migration is usually an east-west kind of migration, but that's not the case. Latin American migrants are going to all parts of the United States, including the South and also the Midwest. So here, all of these folks working at this Tyson plant, they're all migrants and they're all from Latin America. Agriculture has also been very, very important for Latin American migrants. It's been important here in California in the 1960s and is still important today. I drive you regularly to Napa, and if you go very, very early, you see this sea of brown folks working very, very hard, to actually produce our fine Merlots and Cabernet Sauvignons, no? Here are Haitians working in the construction industry and also Mexicans working in the construction industry. Here are Latin Americans. This is one of my other areas of specialization, immigrants working in day laborers throughout the state of California. This is one of my really close informants. This guy sort of showed me what is it meant to be an immigrant, and specifically, what did it mean to be an undocumented migrant in the streets of Los Angeles. In the world of restaurants, immigrants are super, super valuable. I always tell my students, pay attention when you go to restaurants. So who's in the back of the house? Who's washing the dishes? Who's preparing our food? There's a big probability that they're immigrants, and many of these immigrants are from Latin America. I love this map. I hope all of you could see it, and if you cannot see it, you'll be able to see it once you access the Moodle page. But it basically tells us the most common job held by immigrants throughout the whole United States. And you could really figure out all the different types of work that immigrants contribute and do here in the United States. All right, let me talk a little bit about the worst job in New York. And I have a video for all of you. Really, really valuable. A lot of Americans don't want to do this kind of work. All right, so let me just finalize my lecture by talking very briefly about how the United States attempts to control immigration. So here, what's key about this is that the focus is always on the southern border. All right, the focus is always on the southern border. And during the last 30 years or so, the US government has invested millions and millions of dollars to deter immigrants. And the way I like to sort of see it is that the US government has militarized the border. And it has built walls and invested in individuals to sort of deter immigrants. And I want to sort of showcase that with a couple of just images and pics. So this is the kind of technology that the border folks have to deter immigrants. So they have remote video surveillance. They have these sort of aircrafts to sort of monitor and deter the immigrants from actually crossing into the United States. And of course, the increase of presence of the Border Patrol. This number of folks being hired has just skyrocketed. But what's significant about this, and of course we have the wall. Now, President Trump has referred to as he's going to build a beautiful wall. And please note this, we already have had the wall for a number of years. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. But of course, the border is a 2,000-mile border. And the question is, does the wall really work? And I want to finish my lecture by showing you all this very, very short video.
That's really, really important. Immigrants are still coming. They're finding a way to actually go around the wall. And
the best of solutions in terms of deterring the immigrants. Okay, I think I have like a minute or two. Let me open it up for questions. If somebody has a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Danielle, I've heard actually that the flow of immigrants from the Southland is really diminishing. Is that true as far as you know?
It is correct. So the question was, for those of you who did not listen, that migration has actually diminished, and that's completely true. It has to do with a number of factors within Mexico. Births are actually going down. The economy has not been that bad, and the numbers have actually diminished. And it's actually plateaued. During the 1980s and 90s, Mexican migration was skyrocketing, and 2000 to the present. And of course, this is also connected with the demand of jobs. There's lesser jobs offered for low-skilled individuals, and consequently, migration from Mexico has in fact plateaued. The researchers tell us today that there's more migrants coming from Asia than from Latin America. Today, 2018, 2017. So great question. Other questions? Please come and see me at 4 p.m. at the round table.